This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kelly Bashir of Mattapoisett, Massachusetts. Don Quixote, Volume 1, by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra. Translated by John Ormsby.
Chapters 36 through 38. Chapter 36,
which treats of more curious incidents that occurred at the inn. Just at that instant the landlord, who was standing at the gate of the inn, exclaimed, "Here comes a fine troop of guests. If they stop here we may say Gaudeamus." "What are they?" said Cardenio. "4 men," said the landlord, "riding a la ginetta, with lances and bucklers, and all with black veils, and with them there is a woman in white, on a side saddle, whose face is also veiled, and 2 attendants on foot." "Are they very near?" said the curate. "So near," answered the lord, "that here they come." Hearing this, Dorothea covered her face, and Cardenio retreated into Don Quixote's room, and they hardly had time to do so before the whole party the host had described entered the inn, and the 4 that were on horseback, who were of high-bred appearance and bearing, dismounted and came forward to take down the woman who rode on the side saddle, and one of them, taking her in his arms, placed her in a chair that stood at the entrance of the room where Cardenio had hidden himself. All this time she nor they had removed their veils or spoken a word. Only on sitting down on the chair the woman gave a deep sigh and let her arms fall like one that was ill and weak. The attendants on foot then led the horses away to the stable. Observing this, the curate, curious to know who these people in such a dress and preserving silence were, went to where the servants were standing and put the question to one of them, and who answered him, "Faith, sir, I cannot tell you who they are. I only know they seem to be people of distinction, particularly he who advanced to take the lady you saw in his arms. And I say so because all the rest show him respect, and nothing is done except what he directs and orders." "And the lady, who is she?" asked the curate. "That I cannot tell you either," said the servant, "for I have neither seen her face all the way. I have indeed heard her sigh many times, and utter such groans that she seems to be giving up the ghost every time, but it is no wonder if we do not know more than we have told you, as my comrade and I have only been in their company 2 days. For having met us on the road, they begged and persuaded us to accompany them to Andalusia, promising to pay us well." "And have you heard any of them called by his name?" asked the curate. "No, indeed," replied the servant. "They all preserve a marvellous silence on the road, for not a sound is to be heard among them except the poor lady's sighs and sobs, which make us pity her. And we feel sure that wherever it is she is going it is against her will, and as far as one can judge from her dress she is a nun, or what is more likely, about to become one, and perhaps it is because taking the vows is not of her own free will that she is so unhappy as she seems to be." "That may well be," said the curate, and leaving them he returned to where Dorothea was, who, hearing the veiled lady sigh, moved by natural compassion, drew near to her and said, "What are you suffering from, señor? If it be anything that women are accustomed and know how to relieve, I offer you my services with all my heart." To this the unhappy lady made no reply, and Dorothea repeated her offers more earnestly, and still she kept silence, until the gentleman with the veil, who the servant said was obeyed by the rest, approached and said to Dorothea, "Do not give yourself the trouble, señor, of making any offers to that woman, for it is her way to give no thanks for anything that is done for her. And do not try to make her answer unless you want to hear some lie from her lips." "I have never told a lie," was the immediate reply of her who had been silent until now. "On the contrary, it is because I am so truthful and so ignorant of lying devices that I am now in this miserable condition, and this I call you yourself to witness, for it is my unstained truth that has made you false and a liar." Cardenio heard these words clearly and distinctly, being close to the speaker, for there was only the door of the Don Quixote's room between them, and the instant he did so, uttering a loud exclamation, he cried, "Good God, what is this I hear? What voice is this that has reached my ears?" Startled at the voice, the lady turned her head, and not seeing the speaker, she stood up and attempted to enter the room, observing which the gentleman held her back, preventing her from moving a step. In her agitated and sudden movement, the silk with which she had covered her face fell off and disclosed a countenance of incomparable and marvellous beauty, but pale and terrified, for she kept turning her eyes, and everywhere she could direct her gaze with an eagerness that made her look as if she had lost her senses, and so marked that it excited the pity of Dorothea, and all beheld her, though they knew not what caused it. The gentleman grasped her firmly by the shoulders, and being so fully occupied with holding her back, he was unable to put a hand to his veil, which was falling off, as it did at length entirely, and Dorothea, who was holding the lady in her arms, raised her eyes and saw that he who likewise held her was her husband, Don Fernando. The instant she recognized him with a prolonged plaintive cry drew from the depths of her heart. She fell backwards fainting, and but for the barber being close by to catch her in his arms, she would have fallen completely to the ground. The curate at once hastened to uncover her face and throw water on it. As he did so, Don Fernando, for he it was who held the other in his arms, recognized her and stood as if death-stricken by the sight. Not, however, relaxing his grip of Luscinda, for it was she that was struggling to release himself from his hold, having recognized Cardenio by his voice as he had recognized her. Cardenio also heard Dorothea's cry as she fell fainting, and imagining that it came from his Luscinda, burst forth in terror from the room, and the first thing he saw was Don Fernando with Luscinda in his arms. Don Fernando too knew Cardenio at once, and all three, Luscinda, Cardenio, and Dorothea, stood in silent amazement, scarcely knowing what had happened to them. They gazed at one another without speaking, Dorothea at Don Fernando at Cardenio, Cardenio at Luscinda, and Luscinda at Cardenio. The first to break the silence was Luscinda, who thus addressed Don Fernando. "Leave me, Señor Don Fernando, for the sake of what you owe to yourself. If no other reason will induce you, leave me to cling to the wall of which I am the ivy, to the support from which neither your importunities, nor your threats, nor your promises, nor your gifts have been able to detach me. See how heaven, by ways strange and hidden from our sight, has brought me face to face with my true husband, and well you know by dear-bought experience that death alone will be able to efface him from my memory. May this plain declaration then lead you, as you can do nothing else, to turn your love into rage, your affection into resentment, and so to take my life, for if I yield it up in the presence of my beloved husband, I count it well bestowed. It may be by my death you will be convinced that I kept faith to him to the last moments of life." Meanwhile Dorothea had come to herself, and had heard Luscinda's words, by means of which she divined who she was, but seeing that Don Fernando did not yet release or reply to her, summoning up her resolution as well as she could, she rose and knelt at his feet, and with a flood of bright and touching tears addressed him thus: "If, my lord, the beams of that sun that thou holdest eclipsed in thine arms did not dazzle and rob thine eyes of sight, thou wouldst have seen by this time that she who kneels at thy feet is, so long as thou wilt have it, so the unhappy and unfortunate Dorothea. I am that lowly peasant girl whom in thy goodness or for thy pleasure wouldst raise high enough to call herself thine. I am she who in the seclusion of innocence led a contented life until at the voice of thy importunity and thy true and tender passion, as it seemed, she opened the gates of her modesty and surrendered to thee the keys of her liberty, a gift received by thee but thanklessly, as it is shown by my forced retreat to the place where thou dost find me, and by thy appearance under the circumstance in which I see thee. Nevertheless, I would not have thee suppose that I have come here driven by my shame. It is only grief and sorrow at seeing myself forgotten by thee that have led me. It was thy will to make me thine, and thou didst so follow thy will, and that now, even thou repentest, thou canst not help being mine. Bethink thee, my lord, the unsurpassable affection I bear thee may compensate for the beauty and noble birth for which thou wouldst desert me. Thou canst not be the fair Lucinda's because thou art mine, nor can she be thine because she is Cardenio's, and it will be easier, remember, to bend thy will to love one who adores thee, than to lead one to love thee who abhors thee now. Thou didst address thyself to my simplicity, thou didst lay siege to my virtue, thou wert not ignorant of my station. Well dost thou know how I yielded wholly to thy will. There is no ground or reason for thee to plead deception, and if it be so, as it is, and if thou art a Christian as thou art a gentleman, why dost thou by such subterfuges put off making me as happy at last as thou didst at first? And if thou wilt not have me for what I am, thy true and lawful wife, at least take and accept me as thy slave, for so long as I am thine I will count myself happy and fortunate. Do not by deserting me let my shame become the talk of the gossips in the street. Make not the old age of my parents miserable, for the loyal services they, as faithful vassals, have ever rendered thine are not deserving of such a return, and if thou thinkest it will debase thy blood to mingle with mine, reflect that there is little or no nobility in the world that has not travelled in the same road, and that in illustrious lineages it is not the woman's blood that is of account, and moreover that true nobility consists in virtue, and if thou art wanting in that, refusing me what in justice thou owest me, then even I have higher claims to nobility than thine. To make an end, señor, these are my last words to thee, whether thou wilt or wilt not. I am thy wife. Witness thy words, which must not and ought not to be false. If thou dost pride thyself on what for want of which thou scornest me, witness the pledge which thou didst give me, and witness heaven, which thou thyself didst call to witness the promise thou hadst made me. And if all this fail, my own conscience will not fail to lift up its silent voice in the midst of all thy gaiety, and vindicate the truth of what I say, and mar thy highest pleasure and enjoyment. All this and more the injured Dorothea delivered with such earnest feeling and such tears that all present, even those who came with Don Fernando, were constrained to join her in them. Don Fernando listened to her without replying, until, ceasing to speak, she gave way to such sobs and sighs that it must have been a heart of brass that was not softened by the sight of so great sorrow. Lucinda stood regarding her with no less compassion for her sufferings than admiration for her intelligence and beauty, and would have gone to her to say some words of comfort to her, but was prevented by Don Fernando's grasp, which held her fast. He, overwhelmed with confusion and astonishment, after regarding Dorothea for some moments with a fixed gaze, opened his arms, and releasing Lucinda, exclaimed, "Thou hast conquered, fair Dorothea, thou hast conquered, for it is impossible to have the heart to deny the united force of so many truths." Lucinda in her feebleness was on the point of falling to the ground when Don Fernando released her, but Cardenio, who stood near, having retreated behind Don Fernando to escape recognition, casting aside fear and regardless of what might happen, ran forward to support her, and said as he clasped her in his arms, "If heaven in its compassion is willing to let thee rest at last, mistress of my heart, true, constant, and fair, nowhere canst thou rest more safely than in these arms that now receive thee, and received thee before when fortune permitted me to call thee mine." At these words Lucinda looked up at Cardenio, at first beginning to recognize him by his voice, and then satisfying herself by her eyes that it was he, and hardly knowing what she did, and heedless of all considerations of decorum, she flung her arms around his neck, and pressing her face close to his, said, "Yes, my dear lord, you are the true master of this your slave, and even though adverse fate interpose again, and fresh dangers threaten this life that hangs on yours." A strange sight was this for Don Fernando and those that stood around, filled with surprise at an incident so unlooked for. Dorothea fancied that Don Fernando changed colour and looked as though he meant to take vengeance on Cardenio, for she observed him put his hand to his sword, and the instant the idea struck her, with wonderful quickness she clasped him round the knees, and kissing them and holding him so as to prevent his moving, she said, while her tears continued to flow, "What is it thou wouldst do, my only refuge in this unforeseen event? Thou hast thy wife at thy feet, and she whom thou wouldst have for thy wife is in the arms of her husband. Reflect whether it will be right for thee, whether it will be possible for thee to undo what heaven has done, or whether it will be becoming in thee to seek to raise her to be thy mate, who in spite of every obstacle, and strong in her truth and constancy, is before thine eyes, bathing with the tears of love the face and bosom of her lawful husband. For God's sake I entreat of thee, for thine own I implore thee, let not this open manifestation rouse thy anger, but rather so calm it as to allow these two lovers to live in peace and quiet without any interference from thee so long as heaven permits them, and in so doing thou wilt prove the generosity of thy lofty noble spirit, and the world shall see with thee reason has more influence than passion." All the time Dorothea was speaking, Cardenio, though he held Lucinda in his arms, never took his eyes off Don Fernando, determined, if he saw him make any hostile movement, to try and defend himself, and resist as best he could all who might assail him, though it should cost him his life. But now Don Fernando's friends, as well as the curate and the barber who had been present all the while, not forgetting the worthy Sancho Panza, ran forward and gathered round Don Fernando, entreating him to have regard for the tears of Dorothea, and not suffer her reasonable hopes to be disappointed, since, as they firmly believed what she said was the truth, and bidding him observe that it was not, as it might seem by accident, but a special disposition of Providence that they had all met in a place where no one could have expected a meeting. And the curate bade him remember that only death could part Lucinda from Cardenio, and even if some sword were to separate them, they would think their death most happy, and that in a case that admitted of no remedy his wisest course was, by conquering and putting a constraint upon himself, to show a generous mind, and of his own accord suffer these two to enjoy the happiness heaven had granted them. He bade him, too, turn his eyes upon the beauty of Dorothea, and he would see that few, if any, could equal, much less excel her, while to that beauty should be added her modesty and the surpassing love she bore him. But besides all this, he reminded him that if he prided himself on being a gentleman and a Christian, he could not do otherwise than keep his plighted word, and that in doing so he would obey God and meet the approval of all sensible people who know and recognize it to be the privilege of beauty, even in one of humble birth, provided virtue accompany it, to be able to raise herself to the level of any rank, without any slur upon him who places it upon an equality with himself, and furthermore, that when the potent sway of passion asserts itself, so long as there be no mixture of sin in it, he is not to be blamed who gives way to it. To be brief, they added to these such other forcible arguments that Don Fernando's manly heart, being after all nourished by noble blood, was touched, and yielded to the truth which, even had he wished it, he could not gainsay. And he showed his submission and acceptance of the good advice that had been offered him by stooping down and embracing Dorothea, saying to her, "Rise, dear lady, it is not right that what I hold in my heart should be kneeling at my feet, and if until now I have shown no sign of what I own, it may have been by heaven's decree, in order that, seeing the constancy with which you love me, I may learn to value you as you deserve. What I entreat of you is that you reproach me not with my transgression and grievous wrongdoing, for the same cause and force that drove me to make you mine impelled me to struggle against being yours, and to prove this, turn and look at the eyes of the now happy Lucinda, and you will see in them an excuse for all my errors, and as she has found and gained the object of her desires, and I have found in you what satisfies all my wishes, may she live in peace and contentment and as many happy years with her Cardenio, as on my knees I pray heaven to allow me to live with my Dorothea." And with these words he once more embraced her and pressed his face to hers with so much tenderness that he had to take great heed to keep his tears from completing the proof of his love and repentance in the sight of all. Not so Lucinda and Cardenio, and almost all the others, for they shed so many tears, some in their own happiness, some at that of the others, that one would have supposed a heavy calamity had fallen upon them all. Even Sancho Panza was weeping, though afterwards he said he only wept because he saw that Dorothea was not as he fancied the Queen Comicona, of whom he had expected such great favours. Their wonder, as well as their weeping, lasted some time, and then Cardenio and Lucinda went on and fell on their knees before Don Fernando, returning him thanks for the favour he had rendered them in language so grateful that he knew not how to answer them, and raising them up embraced them with every mark of affection and courtesy. He then asked Dorothea how she managed to reach a place so far removed from her own home, and she, in a few fitting words, told all that she had previously related to Cardenio, with which Don Fernando and his companions were so delighted that they wished the story had been longer, so charmingly did Dorothea describe her misadventures. When she had finished, Don Fernando recounted what had befallen him in the city after he had found Lucinda's bosom paper in which she declared that she was Cardenio's wife, and could never be his. He said he meant to kill her, and would have done so had he not been prevented by her parents, and that he quitted the house full of rage and shame, and resolved to avenge himself when a more convenient opportunity should offer. The next day he learned that Lucinda had disappeared from her father's house, and that no one could tell whither she had gone. Finally, at the end of some months, he ascertained that she was in a convent, and meant to remain there all the rest of her life if she were not to share it with Cardenio. And as soon as he had learned this, taking these 3 gentlemen as his companions, he arrived at the place where she was, but avoided speaking to her, fearing that if it were known he was there, stricter precautions would be taken in the convent, and watching a time when the porter's lodge was open, he left 2 to guard the gate, and he and the other entered the convent in quest of Lucinda, whom they found in the cloisters in conversation with one of the nuns, and carrying her off without giving her time to resist, they reached a place with her where they provided themselves with what they required for taking her away, all which they were able to do in complete safety, as the convent was in the country at a considerable distance from the city. He added that when Lucinda found herself in his power, she lost all consciousness, and after returning to herself did nothing but weep and sigh without speaking a word. And thus in silence and tears they had reached that inn, which for him was reaching heaven, where all the mischances of earth are over and at an end. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37, in which is continued the story of the famous Princess Micomicona, with other droll adventures. To all this Sancho listened with no little sorrow at heart to see how his hopes of dignity were fading away and vanishing in smoke, and how the fair Princess Micomicona had turned into Dorothea, and the giant into Don Fernando, while his master was sleeping tranquilly, totally unconscious of all that had come to pass. Dorothea was unable to persuade herself that her present happiness was not all a dream. Cardenio was in a similar state of mind, and Lucinda's thoughts ran in the same direction. Don Fernando gave thanks to heaven for the favour shown him, and for having been rescued from the intricate labyrinth in which he had been brought so near to the destruction of his good name and of his soul. And in short, everybody at the inn was full of contentment and satisfaction at the happy issue of such a complicated and hopeless business. The curate, as a sensible man, made sound reflections upon the whole affair, and congratulated each upon his good fortune. But the one that was in the highest spirits and good humour was the landlady, because of the promise Cardenio and the curate had given her to pay for all the losses and damage she had sustained through Don Quixote's means. Sancho, as has already been said, was the only one who was distressed, unhappy, and dejected. And so with a long face he went in to his master, who had just awoke, and said to him, "Sir Rueful Countenance, your worship may as well sleep on as much as you like, without troubling yourself about killing any giant, or restoring her kingdom to the princess, for that is all over and settled now." "I should think it was," replied Don Quixote, "for I have had the most prodigious and stupendous battle with the giant that I ever remember having had all the days of my life, and with one back stroke, swish, I brought his head tumbling to the ground, and so much blood gushed forth from him that it ran in rivulets over the earth like water." "Like red wine, your worship had better say," replied Sancho, "for I would have you know, if you don't know it, that the dead giant is a hacked wineskin, and the blood 24 gallons of red wine that it had in its belly, and the cut off head is the bitch that bore me, and the devil take it all." "What art thou talking about, fool?" said Don Quixote. "Art thou in thy senses?" "Let your worship get up," said Sancho, "and you will see the nice business you have made of it, and what we have to pay, and you will see the queen turned into the private lady called Dorothea, and other things that will astonish you if you understand them." "I shall not be surprised at anything of the kind," returned Don Quixote, "for if thou dost remember the last time we were here I told thee that everything that happened here was a matter of enchantment, and it would be no wonder if it were the same now." "I could believe all that," replied Sancho, "if my blanketing was the same sort of thing also, only it wasn't, but real and genuine, for I saw the landlord, who was here today, holding one end of the blanket and jerking me up to the skies very neatly and smartly, and with as much laughter and strength, and when it comes to be a cause of knowing people, I hold for my part, simple and sinner as I am, that there is no enchantment about it at all, but a great deal of bruising and bad luck." "Well, well, God will give a remedy," said Don Quixote. "Hand me my clothes and let me go out, for I want to see these transformations and things thou speakest of." Sancho fetched him his clothes, and while he was dressing, the curate gave Don Fernando and the others present an account of Don Quixote's madness and of the stratagem they had made use of to withdraw him from that pena pobre where he fancied himself stationed because of his lady's scorn. He described to them also nearly all the adventures that Sancho had mentioned, at which they marvelled and laughed not a little, thinking it, as all did, the strangest form of madness a crazy intellect could be capable of. But now the curate said that the lady Dorothea's good fortune prevented her from proceeding with their purpose. It would be necessary to devise or discover some other way of getting him home. Cardenio proposed to carry out the scheme they had begun, and suggested that Luscinda would act and support Dorothea's part sufficiently well. "No," said Don Fernando, "that must not be, for I want Dorothea to follow out this idea of hers, and if the worthy gentleman's village is not very far off, I shall be happy if I can do anything for his relief." "It is not more than 2 days' journey from this," said the curate. "Even if it were more," said Don Fernando, "I would gladly travel so far for the sake of doing so good a work." At this moment Don Quixote came out in full panoply, with Mambrino's helmet, all dinted as it was, on his head, his buckler on his arm, and leading on his staff or pike. The strange figure he presented filled Don Fernando and the rest with amazement as they contemplated his lean yellow face, half a league long, his armour of all sorts, and the solemnity of his deportment. They stood silent, waiting to see what he would say, and he, fixing his eyes on the fair Dorothea, addressed her with great gravity and composure. "I am informed, fair lady, by my squire here, that your greatness has been annihilated and your being abolished, since from a queen and lady of high degree as you used to be, you have been turned into a private maiden. If this has been done by the command of the magician king your father, though fear that I should not afford you the aid you need and are entitled to, I may tell you he did not know, and does not know, half the mass, and was little versed in the annals of chivalry, for if he had read and gone through them as attentively and deliberately as I have, he would have found at every turn that knights of less renown than mine have accomplished things more difficult. It is no great matter to kill a whelp of a giant, however arrogant he may be, for it is not many hours since I myself was engaged with one, and I will not speak of it, that they may not say I am lying. Time, however, that reveals all, will tell the tale when we least expect it." "You were engaged with a couple of wineskins and not a giant," said the landlord at this. But Don Fernando told him to hold his tongue and on no account interrupt Don Quixote, who continued, "I say in conclusion, high disinherited lady, that if your father had brought about this metamorphosis in your person for the reason I have mentioned, you ought not attach any importance to it, for there is no peril on earth through which my sword will not force a way, and with it, before many days are over, I will bring your enemy's head to the ground, and place on yours the crown of your kingdom." Don Quixote said no more, and waited for the reply of the princess, who, aware of Don Fernando's determination to carry on the deception until Don Quixote had been conveyed to his home, with great ease of manner and gravity made answer, "Whoever told you, valiant knight of the rueful countenance, that I had undergone any change of transformation did not tell you the truth, for I am the same as I was yesterday. It is true that certain strokes of good fortune that have given me more than I could have hoped for have made some alteration in me, but I have not therefore ceased to be what I was before, or to entertain the same desire I have had all through of availing myself of the might of your valiant and invincible arm. And so, señor, let your goodness reinstate the father that begot me in your good opinion, and be assured that he was a wise and prudent man, since by his craft he found out such a sure and easy way of remedying my misfortune, for I believe, señor, that had it not been for you I should never have lit upon the good fortune I now possess. And in this I am saying what is perfectly true, as most of these gentlemen who are present can fully testify. All that remains is to set out on our journey tomorrow, for today we could not make much way, and for the rest of the happy result I am looking forward to, I trust to God and the valour of your heart." So said the sprightly Dorothea, and on hearing her Don Quixote returned to Sancho, and said to him with an angry air, "I declare now, little Sancho, thou art the greatest little villain in Spain. Say, thief and vagabond, hast thou not just told me that this princess had been turned into a maiden called Dorothea, and that the head which I am persuaded I cut off from a giant was the bitch that bore thee, and other nonsense that put me in the greatest perplexity I have ever been in all my life? I vow," and here he looked to heaven and ground his teeth, "I have a mind to play the mischief with thee in a way that will teach sense for the future to all lying squires of knight errants in the world." "Let your worship be calm, señor," returned Sancho, "for it may well be that I have been mistaken as to the change of the lady princess my Comicona, but as to the giant's head, or at least to the piercing of the wineskins and the blood being red wine, I make no mistake, as sure as there is a God, because the wounded skins are there at the head of your worship's bed, and the wine has made a lake of the room. If not, you will see when the eggs come to be fried. I mean when his worship the landlord calls for all the damages. For the rest, I am heartily glad that her ladyship is the queen as she was, for it concerns me as much as anyone." "I tell thee again, Sancho, thou art a fool," said Don Quixote. "Forgive me, and that will do." "That will do," said Don Fernando. "Let us say no more about it, and as her ladyship the princess proposes to set out tomorrow because it is too late today, so be it, and we will pass the night in a pleasant conversation, and tomorrow we will all accompany Señor Don Quixote, for we wish to witness the valiant and unparalleled achievements he is about to perform in the course of his mighty enterprise which he has undertaken." "It is I who shall wait upon and accompany you," said Don Quixote, "and I am much gratified by the favour that is bestowed upon me and the good opinion entertained of me, which I shall strive to justify, or it shall cost me my life, or even more, if it can possibly cost me more." Many were the compliments and expressions of politeness that passed between Don Quixote and Don Fernando, but they were brought to an end by a traveller who at this moment entered the inn, and who, seen from his attire to be a Christian lately come from the country of the Moors, for he was dressed in a short-skirted coat of blue cloth with half sleeves and without a collar. His breeches were also of blue cloth, and his hat of the same colour, and he wore yellow buckskins and had a Moorish cutlass slung from a baldric across his breast. Behind him, mounted upon an ass, there came a woman dressed in Moorish fashion, with her face veiled and a scarf on her head, and wearing a little brocaded cap and a mantle that covered her from her shoulders to feet. The man was of a robust and well-proportioned frame, in age a little over 40, rather swarthy in complexion, with long moustache and a full beard, and in short, his appearance was such that if he had been well dressed he would have been taken for a person of quality and good birth. On entering he asked for a room, and when they told him there was none in the inn, he seemed distressed, and approaching her by her dress seemed to be more, he took her down from the saddle in his arms. Luscinda Dorothea, the landlady, her daughter and Maritornes, attracted by the strange and to them entirely new costume, gathered round her, and Dorothea, who was always kindly, courteous, and quick-witted, perceiving that both she and the man who had brought her were annoyed at not finding a room, said to her, Do not be put out, señor, by the discomfort and want of luxuries here, for it is the way of roadside inns to be without them. Still, if you will be pleased to share our lodging with us," pointing to Luscinda, "perhaps you will have found worse accommodation in the course of your journey." To this the veiled lady made no reply. All she did was to rise from her seat, crossing her hands upon her bosom, bowing her head and bending her body as a sign that she returned thanks. From her silence she concluded that she must be a Moor and unable to speak a Christian tongue. At this moment the captive came up, having been until now otherwise engaged, and seeing that they all stood around his companion, and she made no reply to what they addressed to her, he said, "Ladies, this damsel hardly understands my language, and can speak none but that of her own country, for which reason she does not and cannot answer what has been asked of her." "Nothing has been asked of her," returned Luscinda. "She has only been offered our company for this evening and a share of the quarters we occupy, where she shall be made as comfortable as the circumstances allow. With the good will we are bound to show all strangers that stand in need of it, especially if it be a woman to whom the service is rendered." "On her part and my own, señor," replied the captive, "I kiss your hands, and I esteem highly, as I ought, the favour you have offered, which on such an occasion, and coming from persons of your appearance, is plain to see is a very great one." "Tell me, señora," said Dorothea, "is this lady a Christian or a Moor? For her dress and her silence leads us to imagine that she is what we could wish she was not." "In dress and outwardly," said he, "she is a Moor, but at heart she is thoroughly good Christian, for she has the greatest desire to become one." "Then she has not been baptized," returned Luscinda. "There has been no opportunity for that," replied the captive. "Since she left Algiers, her native country and home, and up to the present she has not found herself in any such imminent danger of death as to make it necessary to baptize her before she has been instructed in all the ceremonies our Holy Mother Church ordains. But, please God, ere long she shall be baptized with a solemnity befitting her, which is higher than her dress or mine indicates." By these words he excited desire in all who heard him to know who the Moorish lady and the captive were, but no one liked to ask just then, seeing that it was a fitter moment for helping them to rest themselves than for questioning them about their lives. Dorothea took the Moorish lady by the hand, and leading her to a seat beside herself, requested her to remove her veil. She looked at the captive as if to ask him what they meant and what she was to do. He said to her in Arabic that they asked her to take off her veil, and thereupon she removed it and disclosed a countenance so lovely that to Dorothea she seemed more beautiful than Luscinda, and to Luscinda more beautiful than Dorothea, and all the bystanders felt that if any beauty could compare with theirs it was the Moorish lady's, and there were even those who were inclined to give it somewhat the preference. And as it is the privilege and charm of beauty to win the heart and secure goodwill, all forthwith became eager to show kindness and attention to the lovely Moor. Don Fernando asked the captive what her name was, and he replied that it was Lela Zoraida, but the instant she heard him she guessed what the Christian had asked, and said hastily with some displeasure and energy, "No, not Zoraida, Maria, Maria," giving them to understand that she was called Maria and not Zoraida. These words, touching earnestness with which she uttered them, drew more than one tear from some of the listeners, particularly the women, who were by nature tender-hearted and compassionate. Luscinda embraced her affectionately, saying, "Yes, yes, Maria, Maria," to which the Moor replied, "Yes, yes, Maria, Zoraida Mencanje," which means not Zoraida. Night was now approaching, and by the orders of those who accompanied Don Fernando, the landlord had taken care and pains to prepare for them the best supper that was in his power. The hour therefore having arrived, they all took their seats at a long table like a refectory one, for round or square table there was none in the inn, and the seat of honour at the head of it, though he was refusing it, they assigned to Don Quixote, who desired the lady Micomicona to place herself by his side, as he was her protector. Luscinda and Zoraida took their places next to her. Opposite them were Don Fernando and Cardenio, next the captive and the other gentlemen, and by the side of the ladies the curate and the barber. And so they supped in high enjoyment, which was increased when they observed Don Quixote leaving off eating, and moved by an impulse like that which made him deliver himself at such length when he supposed with the goatherds, began to address them. "Verily, gentlemen, if we reflect upon it, great and marvellous are the things they see, who make profession of the order of knight-errantry. Say, what being is there in this world who, entering the gate of this castle at this moment, and seeing us as we are here, would suppose or imagine us to be what we are? Who would say that this lady who is beside me was the great queen that we all know her to be, or that I am the knight of the rueful countenance, trumpeted far and wide by the mouth of fame? Now, there can be no doubt that this art and calling surpasses all those that mankind has invented, and is the more deserving of being held in honour in proportion as it is the more exposed to peril. Away with those who assert that letters have the preeminence over arms. I will tell them, whosoever they may be, that they know not what they say, for the reason which such persons commonly assign, and upon which they chiefly rest, is, that the labours of the mind are greater than those of the body, and that the arms give employment to the body alone, as if the calling were a porter's trade, for which nothing is more required than sturdy strength, or as if in what we who profess to call them arms, there were not included acts of vigour for the execution of which high intelligence is requisite, or as if it were the soul of the warrior. Then he has an army, or the defence of a city under his care, did not exert itself as much by mind as by body. Nay, see whether by bodily strength it be possible to learn or divine the intentions of the enemy, his plans, stratagems, or obstacles, or to ward off impending mischief. For all these are the work of the mind, and in them the body has no share whatsoever. Since, therefore, arms have need of the mind as much as letters, let us see now which of the two minds, that of the man of letters or that of the warrior, has most to do. And this will be seen by the end and goal that each seeks to attain, for that purpose is the more estimable which has for its aim the nobler object. The end and goal of letters, I am not speaking now of divine letters, the aim of which is to raise and direct the soul to heaven, for which an end so infinite no other can be compared. I speak of human letters, the end of which is to establish distributive justice, to give every man that which is his, and to see and take care that good laws are observed, and undoubtedly noble, lofty, and deserving of high praise, but not such as should be given to that sought by arms, which have for their end and object peace, the greatest boon that men can desire in this life. The first news the world and mankind received was that which the angels announced on the night that was our day, and they sang in the air, "Glory to God in the highest, and peace on earth to men of good will." And the salutation which the great Master of heaven and earth taught his disciples and chosen followers when they entered any house was to say, "Peace be on this house." And many other times he said to them, "My peace I give unto you, my peace I leave you, peace be with you." A jewel and precious gift given and left by such a hand, a jewel without which there can be no happiness either on heaven or in earth. This peace is the true end of war, and war is only another name for arms. This, then, being admitted that the end of war is peace, and that so far it has the advantages of the end of letters, let us turn to the bodily labours of the man of letters, and those of him who follows the profession of arms, and see which are the greater. Don Quixote delivered his discourse in such a manner and in such correct language that for the time being he made it impossible for any of his hearers to consider him a madman. On the contrary, as they were mostly gentlemen, to whom arms are an appurtenance by birth, they listened to him with greatest pleasure as he continued. "Here, then, I say, is what the student has to undergo. First of all, poverty. Not that all are poor, but to put the case as strongly as possible. And when I have said that he endures poverty, I think nothing more need to be said about his hard fortune, for he who is poor has no share of the good things of life. This poverty he suffers from in various ways, hunger or cold or nakedness or altogether, but for all that it is not so extreme but that he gets something to eat, though it may be at somewhat unseasonable hours and from the leavings of the rich. For the greatest misery of the student is that which they themselves call going out for soup, and there is always some neighbour's brazier or hearth for them, which if it does not warm, at least tempers the cold to them. And lastly, they sleep comfortably at night under a roof. I will not go into other particulars, as for example want of shirts, and no superabundance of shoes, thin and threadbare garments, and gorging themselves to surfeit their voracity when good luck has treated them to a banquet of some sort. By this road that I have described, rough and hard, stumbling here, falling there, getting up again to fall again, they reach the rank they desire, and that once attained, we have seen many who pass these Syrtes and Scyllas and Charybdises, as if borne flying on the wings of favouring fortune. We have seen them, I say, ruling and governing the world from a chair, their hunger turned into satiety, their cold into comfort, their nakedness into fine raiment, their sleep on a mat into repose, and Holland into damask. The justly earned reward of their virtue, but contrasted and compared with that which the warrior undergoes, all they have undergone falls far short of it, as I am now about to show. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38, which treats of the curious discourse Don Quixote delivered on arms and letters. Continuing his discourse, Don Quixote said, "As we began in the student's case with poverty and its accompaniments, let us see now if the soldier is richer, and we shall find that in poverty there is no one poorer, for he is dependent on his miserable pay, which comes late or never, or else on what he can plunder, seriously imperilling his life and conscience, and sometimes his nakedness will be so great that a slashed doublet serves him for uniform and shirt, and in the depth of winter he has to defend himself against the inclemency of the weather in the open field, with nothing better than the breath of his mouth, which I need not say, coming from an empty place, must come out cold, contrary to the laws of nature. To be sure, he looks forward to the approach of night to make up for all of these discomforts on the bed that awaits him, which, unless by some fault of his, never sins by being over narrow, for he can easily measure out on the ground as he likes, and rolling himself about on it to his heart's content without any fear of the sheet slipping away from him. Then, after all this, suppose the day and hour for taking his degree and his calling to have come. Suppose the day of battle to have arrived, when they invest him with a doctor's cap made of lint to mend some bullet hole, perhaps, that has gone through his temples, or left him with a crippled leg or arm. Or if this does not happen, and merciful heaven watches over him, and keeps him safe and sound, it may be he will be in the same poverty he was in before, and he must go through more engagements and more battles, and come victorious out of all before he betters himself. But miracles of that sort are seldom seen. For tell me, sirs, if you have ever reflected upon it, by how much do those who have gained by war fall short of the number of those who have perished in it? No doubt you will reply that there can be no comparison, that the dead cannot be numbered, while the living who have been rewarded may be summed up with three figures, all which is the reverse in the case of men of letters. For by skirts, say nothing of sleeves, they all find means of support, so that though the soldier has more to endure, his reward is less. But against all this it may be urged that it is easier to reward 2,000 soldiers, for the former may be remunerated by giving them places, which must perforce be conferred upon men of their calling, while the latter can only be compensated out of the way of the very property of the master they serve. But this impossibility only strengthens my argument. Putting this, however, aside, for it is a puzzling question for which it is difficult to find a solution, let us return to the superiority of arms over letters, a matter still undecided. So many are the arguments put forward on each side, for that besides those I have mentioned, letters say that without them arms cannot maintain themselves. For war too has its laws and is governed by them, and laws belong to the domain of letters and men of letters. To this arms make answer that without them laws cannot be maintained. For by arms states are defended, kingdoms preserved, cities protected, roads made safe, seas cleared of pirates, and in short, if it were not for them, states, kingdoms, monarchies, cities, ways by sea and land would be exposed to the violence and confusion which war brings it, so long as it lasts and is free to make use of its privileges and powers. And then it is plain that whatever costs most is valued and deserves to be valued most. To attain to eminence in letters costs a man time, watching hunger, nakedness, headaches, indigestions, and other things of the sorts, some of which I have already referred to. But for a man to come in the ordinary course of things to be a good soldier, it costs him all the student suffers, and in an incomparably higher degree. For at each step he runs the risk of losing his life. For what dread of want or poverty that can reach or harass the student can compare with what the soldier feels who finds himself beleaguered in some stronghold, mounting guard in some ravelin or cavalier, knows that the enemy is pushing a mine towards the post where he is stationed, and cannot under any circumstances retire or fly from the imminent danger that threatens him. All he can do is inform his captain of what is going on, so that he may try to remedy it by a countermine, and then stand his ground in fear and expectation of the moment when he will fly up to the clouds without wings and descend into the deep against his will. And if this seems a trifling task, let us see whether it is equalled or surpassed by the encounter of two galleys stem to stem in the midst of the open sea, locked and entangled one with the other, when the soldier has no more standing room than the 2 feet of plank in the spur, and yet, though he sees before him threatening as many ministers of death as there are cannon of the foe pointed at him, not a lance length from his body, and sees that with the first heedless step he will go down to visit the profundities of Neptune's bosom. So with dauntless heart, urged on by honour that nerves him, he makes himself a target for all that musketry, and struggles to cross that narrow path to the enemy's ship. And what is still more marvellous, no sooner has one gone down into the depths he will never rise from till the end of the world, then another takes his place, and if he too falls into the sea that waits for him like an enemy, another and another will succeed him, without a moment's pause between their deaths, courage and daring the greatest that all the chances of war can show. Happy the blessed ages that knew not the dread fury of these devilish engines of artillery, whose inventor, I am persuaded, is in hell, receiving the reward of his diabolical invention, by which he made it easy for a base and cowardly arm to take the life of a gallant gentleman, and that, when he knows not how or whence, in the height of the ardour and enthusiasm that fire and animate brave hearts, there should come some random bullet, discharged perhaps by one who fled in terror at the flash when he fired off his accursed machine, when in an instant puts an end to the projects and cuts off the life of one who deserved to live for ages to come. And thus, when I reflect on this, I am almost tempted to say that in my heart I repent of having adopted this profession of knight-errant in so detestable an age as we live in now. For though no peril can make me fear, still it gives me some uneasiness to think that powder and lead may rob me of the opportunity of making myself famous and renowned throughout the known earth by the might of my arm and the edge of my sword. But heaven's will be done. If I succeed in my attempt, I shall be all the more honoured, as I have faced greater dangers than the knight-errants of yore exposed themselves to. All this lengthy discourse Don Quixote delivered while the others supped, forgetting to raise a morsel to his lips, though Sancho more than once told him to eat his supper, as he would have time enough afterwards to say all he wanted. It excited fresh pity in those who had heard him to see a man of apparently sound sense, and with rational views on every subject he discussed, so hopelessly wanting in all when his wretched, unlucky chivalry was in question. The curate told him he was quite right in all he had said in favour of arms, and that he himself, though a man of letters and a graduate, was of the same opinion. They finished their supper, the cloth was removed, and while the hostess, her daughter, and Maritornes were getting Don Quixote of La Mancha's garret ready, in which it was arranged that the women were to be quartered by themselves for the night, Don Fernando begged the captive to tell them the story of his life, for it could not fail to be strange and interesting, to judge by the hints he had let fall on his arrival in company with Zoraida. To this the captive replied that he would very willingly yield to his request, only he feared his tale would not give them as much pleasure as he wished. Nevertheless, not to be wanting in compliance, he would tell it. The curate and the others thanked him and added their entreaties, and he, finding himself so pressed, said there was no occasion to ask where a command had such weight, and added, "If your worships will give your attention, you will hear a true story which, perhaps, fictitious ones constructed with ingenious and studied art cannot come up to." These words made them settle themselves in their places and preserve a deep silence, and he, seeing them waiting on his words in mute expectation, began thus in a pleasant, quiet voice. End of chapter 38.
End of chapters 36 through 38.
LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kelly Bashir of Mattapoisett, Massachusetts. Don Quixote, Volume 1, by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra. Translated by John Ormsby.
Chapters 39 through 40. Chapter 39.
Wherein the captive relates his life and adventures. My family had its origin in a village in the mountains of Leon, and nature has been kinder and more generous to it than fortune, though in the general poverty of those communities my father passed for being even a rich man, and he would have been so in reality had he been as clever in preserving his property as he was in spending it. This tendency of his to be liberal and profuse he had acquired from having been a soldier in his youth, for the soldier's life is a school in which the niggard becomes free-handed and the free-handed prodigal, and if any soldiers are to be found who are misers, they are monsters of rare occurrence. My father went beyond liberality and bordered on prodigality, and a disposition by no means advantageous to a married man who has children to succeed his name and position. My father had 3, all sons, and all of sufficient age to make choice of a profession. Finding that he was unable to resist his propensity, he resolved to divest himself of the instrument and cause of his prodigality and lavishness, to divest himself of wealth, without which Alexander himself would have seemed parsimonious, and so, calling us all three aside one day into a room, he addressed us in words somewhat to the following effect: "My sons, to ensure you that I love you, no more need be known or said than that you are my sons, and to encourage a suspicion that I do not love you, no more is needed than the knowledge that I have no self-control as far as preservation of your patrimony is concerned. Therefore, that you may for the future feel sure that I love you like a father, and have no wish to ruin you like a stepfather, I propose to do with you what I have for some time back meditated, and after mature deliberation decided upon. You are now of an age to choose your line of life, or at least make choice of a calling that will bring you honour and profit when you are older. And what I have resolved to do is divide my property into 4 parts. 3 I will give to you, to each his portion without making any difference, and the other I will retain to live upon and support myself for whatever remainder of life Heaven may be pleased to grant me. But I wish each of you, on taking possession of the share that falls to him,
to follow one of the paths I shall indicate. In this Spain of ours there is a proverb, to my mind very true, as they all are, being short aphorisms drawn from long practical experience.
The one I refer to says, the church, or the sea, or the king's house, as much as to say, in plainer language, whoever wants to flourish and become rich, let him follow the church, or go to sea, adopting commerce as his calling, or go into the king's service in his household, for they say, better a king's crumb than a lord's favour. I say so, because it is my will and pleasure that one of you should follow letters, another trade, and the third serve the king in the wars, for it is a difficult matter to gain admission to his service and in his household, and if war does not bring much wealth, it confers great distinction and fame. 8 days hence I will give you your full shares in money, without defrauding you of a farthing, as you will see in the end. Now, tell me if you are willing to follow out my idea and advice as I have laid it before you." Having called upon me as the eldest to answer, I, after urging him not to strip himself of his property, but to spend it all as he pleased, we were young men able to gain our living, consented to comply with his wishes, and said that mine were to follow the profession of arms, and thereby serve God and my king. My second brother, having made the same proposal, decided upon going to the Indies, embarking the portion that fell to him in trade. The youngest, and in my opinion the wisest, said he would rather follow the church, or go to complete his studies at Salamanca. As soon as we had come to an understanding and made choice of our professions, my father embraced us all, and in the short time he mentioned, carried into effect all he had promised, and when he had given to each a share, which as well as I remember was 3,000 ducks apiece in cash, for an uncle of ours bought the estate and paid for it down, not to let it go out of the family. We all three on the same day took leave of our good father, and at the same time, as it seemed to me inhuman to leave my father with such scanty means in his old age, I induced him to take 2 of my 3,000 ducats, as the remainder would be enough to provide me with all a soldier needed. My 2 brothers, moved by my example, gave him each 1,000 ducats, so that there was left for my father 4,000 ducats of money, besides 3,000, the value of the portion that fell to him, which he preferred to retain in land instead of selling it. Finally, as I said, we took leave of him, and our uncle whom I have mentioned, not without sorrow and tears on both sides, they charging us to let them know, whenever an opportunity offered, how we fared, whether well or ill. We promised to do so, and when he had embraced us and given us his blessing, one set out for Salamanca, the other for Seville, and I for Alicante, where I had heard there was a Genoese vessel taking in a cargo of wood for Genoa. It is now some 22 years since I left my father's house, and all that time, though I have written several letters, I have had no news whatever of him or my brothers. My own adventures during that period I will now relate briefly. I embarked at Alicante, reached Genoa after a prosperous voyage, and proceeded thence to Milan, where I provided myself with arms and a few soldiers' accoutrements. Thence it was my intention to go and take service in Piedmont, but as I was already on the road to Alessandria de la Paglia, I learned that the Duke of Alva was on his way to Flanders. I changed my plans, joined him, served under him in the campaigns he made, was present at the deaths of the Counts Egmont and Horn, and was promoted to be ensign under a famous captain of Guadalajara, Diego de Urbina by name. Some time after my arrival in Flanders, news came of the league that His Holiness Pope Pius V of happy memory had made with Venice and Spain against the common enemy, the Turk, who had just then with his fleet taken the famous island of Cyprus, which belonged to the Venetians, a loss deplorable and disastrous. It was known as a fact that the most serene Don John of Austria, natural brother of our good King Don Philip, was coming as commander-in-chief of the allied forces, and rumours were abroad of the vast warlike preparations which were being made. Oh, it stirred my heart and filled me with a longing to take part in the campaign which was expected, and though I had reason to believe in almost certain promises that on the first opportunity that presented itself I should be promoted to captain, I preferred to leave all and betake myself, as I did, to Italy, and it was my good fortune that Don John had arrived at Genoa, and was going to Naples to join the Venetian fleet, as he afterwards did at Messina. I say, in short, that I took part in that glorious expedition, promoted by this time to be a captain of infantry, to which honourable charge my good luck rather than my merits raised me. And that day, so fortunate for Christendom, because then all the nations of the earth were disabused of the error which they lay in imagining the Turks to be invincible on sea on that day, I say, on which the Ottoman pride and arrogance were broken, among all that were there made happy, for the Christians who died that day were happier than those who remained alive and victorious. I alone was miserable, for instead of some naval crown that I might have expected had it been in Roman times, or the night that followed that famous day, I found myself with fetters on my feet and manacles on my hands. It happened in this way. El Ucali, the king of Algiers, a daring and successful corsair, having attacked and taken the leading Maltese galley, only 3 knights being left alive in it, and they badly wounded, the chief galley of John Andrea, on board of which I and my company were placed, came to its relief, and doing as was bound to do in such a case, I leaped on board the enemy's galley, which, sheering off from that which had attacked it, prevented my men from following me, and so I found myself alone in the midst of enemies who were in such numbers that I was unable to resist. In short, I was taken, covered with wounds. El Ucali, as you know, sirs, made his escape with his entire squadron, and I was left a prisoner in his power, the only sad being among so many filled with joy, and the only captive among so many free. For there were 15,000 Christians, all at the oar in the Turkish fleet, that regained their longed for liberty that day. They carried me to Constantinople, where the Grand Turk made my master general at sea for having done his duty in battle, and carried off as evidence of his bravery the standard of the Order of Malta. The following year, which was the year 72, I found myself at Navarino, rowing in the leading galley with the 3 lanterns. There I saw and observed how the opportunity of capturing the whole Turkish fleet in harbour was lost, for all the marines and janissaries that belonged to it made sure that they were about to be attacked inside that very harbour, and had their kits and pasamaques or shoes ready to flee at once on shore without waiting to be assailed, and so great fear did they stand of our fleet. But heaven ordered it otherwise, not for any fault or neglect of the general who commanded on our side, but for the sins of Christendom, and because it was God's will and pleasure that we should always have instruments of punishment to chastise us. As it was, El Ucali took refuge at Modon, which is an island near Navarino, and landing forces fortified the mouth of the harbour and waited quietly until Don John retired. On this expedition was taken the galley called the Prize, whose captain was a son of the famous corsair Barbarossa. It was taken by the chief Neapolitan galley called the She-Wolf, commanded by that thunderbolt of war, that father of his men, that successful and unconquered captain Don Alvaro de Bazan, Marquis of Santa Cruz, and I cannot help telling you what took place at the capture of the prize. The son of Barbarossa was so cruel and treated his slaves so badly that when those who were at the oars saw the She-Wolf galley was bearing down upon them and gaining upon them, they all at once dropped their oars and seized their captain, who stood on the stage at the end of the gangway, shouting to them to row lustily, and passing him on from bench to bench, from the poop to the prow, they so bit him that before he got much past the mast his soul had already gone to hell, so great, as I said, was the cruelty with which he treated them and the hatred with which they hated him. We returned to Constantinople the following year, 73. It became known that Don John had seized Tunis and taken the kingdom for the Turks, and placed Muley Hamet in possession, putting an end to the hopes with which Muley Hamida, the cruelest and bravest Moor in the world, entertained of returning to reign there. The Grand Turk took the loss greatly to heart, and with cunning which all his race possess, he made peace with the Venetians, who were much more eager for it than he was. And the following year, 74, he attacked Goletta and the fort which Don John had left half built near Tunis. While all these events were occurring, I was labouring at the oar without any hope of freedom. At least I had no hope of attaining it by ransom, for I was firmly resolved not to write to my father telling him of my misfortunes. At length the Goletta fell, and the fort fell, before which places there were 75,000 regular Turkish soldiers, and more than 4,000 Moors and Arabs, from all parts of Africa, and in the train of all this great host such munitions and engines of war, and so many pioneers, that with their hands they might have covered the Goletta and the fort with handfuls of earth. The first to fall was the Goletta, until then reckoned impregnable, and it fell not by any fault of his defenders, who did all they could and should have done, but because experiment proved how easily entrenchments could be made in the desert sand there, for water used to be found at 2 palms depth, while the Turks found none at 2 yards, and so by means of a quantity of sandbags they raised their work so high that they commanded the walls of the fort, sweeping them as if from a cavalier, so that no one was able to make a stand or maintain the defence. It was a common opinion that our men should not have shut themselves up in the Goletta, but should have waited in the open at the landing place, but those who say so talk at random and with little knowledge of such matters. For if in the Goletta and in the fort there were barely 7,000 soldiers, how could such a small number, however resolute, sally out and hold their own against numbers like those of the enemy? And how is it possible to help losing a stronghold that is not relieved above all when surrounded by a host of determined enemies in their own country? But many thought, and I thought so too, that it was a special favour and mercy which Heaven showed to Spain in permitting the destruction of that source and hiding place of mischief, that devourer, sponge, and moth of countless money, fruitlessly wasted there to no other purpose save preserving the memory of its capture by the invincible Charles V, as if to make that eternal as it is and will be. These stones were needed to support it. The fort also fell, but the Turks had to win it inch by inch, for the soldiers who defended it fought so gallantly and stoutly that the number of the enemy killed in 22 general assaults exceeded 25,000. Of 300 that remained alive, not one was taken unwounded, a clear and manifest proof of their gallantry and resolution, and how sturdily they had defended themselves and held their post. A small fort or tower, which was in the middle of the lagoon, under command of Don Juan Zanogura, a Valencian gentleman and a famous soldier, capitulated upon terms. They took prisoner Don Pedro Portocarrero, commander of the Goletta, who had done all in his power to defend his fortress, and took the loss of it so much to heart that he died of grief on the way to Constantinople, where they were carrying him a prisoner. They also took the commander of the fort, Gabriel Cerbellon by name, a Milanese gentleman, a great engineer, and a very brave soldier. In these 2 fortresses perished many persons of note, among whom was Pagano Doria, knight of the Order of St. John, a man of generous disposition, as was shown by his extreme liberality to his brother, the famous John Andrea Doria, and what made his death the more sad was that he was slain by some Arabs to whom, seeing that the fort was now lost, he entrusted himself, and who offered to conduct him in the guise of a Moor to Tabarca, a small fort or station on the coast held by the Genoese, employed by the coral fishery. These Arabs cut off his head and carried it to the commander of the Turkish fleet, who proved on them the truth of our Castilian proverb that though the treason may please, the traitor is hated, for they say he ordered those who brought him the present to be hanged for not having brought him alive. Among the Christians who were taken in the fort was one named Don Pedro de Aguilar, a native of some place, I know not what, in Andalusia, who had been my ensign in the fort, a soldier of great repute and rare intelligence, who had in particular a special gift for what they call poetry. I say so because his fate brought him to my galley and to my bench, and made him a slave to the same master. Before we left the port, this gentleman composed 2 sonnets by way of epitaphs, one on the Goletta and the other on the fort. Indeed, I may as well repeat them, for I have them by heart, and I think they will be liked rather than disliked. The instant the captain mentioned the name of Don Pedro de Aguilar, Don Fernando looked at his companions, and they all 3 smiled, and when he came to speak of the sonnets, one of them said, "Before your worship proceeds any further, I entreat you to tell me what became of that Don Pedro de Aguilar you have spoken of." "All I know is," replied the captive, "that after having been in Constantinople 2 years, he escaped in the disguise of an Arnaut, in company with a Greek spy, but whether he regained his liberty or not I cannot tell, though I fancy he did, because a year afterwards I saw the Greek at Constantinople, though I was unable to ask him what the result of the journey was." "Well, then, you are right," returned the gentleman, "for that Don Pedro is my brother, and he is now in our village in good health, rich, married, and with 3 children. Thanks be to God for all the mercies he has shown him," said the captive, "for to my mind there is no happiness on earth to compare with recovering lost liberty. And what is more," said the gentleman, "I know the sonnets my brother made." "Let your worship repeat them," said the captive, "for you will recite them better than I can." "With all my heart," said the gentleman. "The Don the Goletta runs thus." End of chapter 39. Chapter 40, in which the story of the captive is continued. Sonnet. Blessed souls that, from this mortal husk set free, in guerdon of brave deeds beatified, above this lowly orb of ours abide, made heirs of heaven and immortality, with noble rage and ardour glowing ye. Your strength, while strength was yours, in battle plied, and with your own blood and the foeman's died. The sandy soil and the encircling sea, it was the ebbing lifeblood first that failed, the weary arms, the stout hearts never quailed. Though vanquished, yet ye earned the victor's crown, though mourned, yet still triumphant was your fall. For there ye won, between the sword and wall, in heaven glory and on earth renown. That is exactly according to my recollection, said the captive. Well, that on the fort, said the gentleman, if my memory serves me, goes thus. Up from this wasted soil, this shattered shell, whose walls and towers here in ruin lie, 3,000 soldiers took wing on high. In the bright mansions of the blessed to dwell, the onslaught of the foemen to repel. By might of arm all vainly did they try, and when at length was left but them to die, wearied and few the last offenders fell, all this same arid soil hath ever been a haunt of countless mournful memories, as well in our days as in days of yore. But never yet to heaven it sent, I ween, for it hard bosom purer souls than these, braver bodies on its surface bore. The sonnets were not disliked, and the captive was rejoiced at the tidings they gave him of his comrade. And continuing his tale, he went on to say, the Goletta and the fort thus being in their hands, the Turks gave orders to dismantle the Goletta, for the fort was reduced to such a state that there was nothing left to level. And to do the work more quickly and easily, they mined it in 3 places. But nowhere were they able to blow up the part which seemed to be the least strong, that is to say, the old walls, while all that remained standing of the new fortifications that the Freton had made came close to the ground with the greatest ease. Finally the fleet returned victorious and triumphant to Constantinople, and after a few months died my master Elucali, otherwise Ucali Fartax, which means in Turkish the scabby renegade. For that he was, it is in the practice with Turks to name people from some defect or virtue they may possess. The reason being that there are among them only 4 surnames belonging to families tracing their descent from the Ottoman house, and the others, as I have said, take their names and surnames either from bodily blemishes or moral qualities. This scabby one rode at the oar as a slave of the great seigneurs for 14 years, and when over 34 years of age, in resentment at having been struck by a Turk while at the oar, turned renegade and renounced his faith in order to be able to revenge himself, and such was his valour that, without owing his advancements to the base ways and means by which the most favourites of the Grand Seignior rise to power, he came to be the King of Algiers and afterwards General on Sea, which is the 3rd place of trust in the realm. He was a Calabrian by birth, and a worthy man morally, and he treated his slaves with great humanity. He had 3,000 of them, and after his death they were divided, as he directed by his will, between the Grand Seignior, who was heir of all who die and shares with the children of the deceased, and his renegades. I fell to the lot of a Venetian renegade, who, when a cabin boy on board a ship, had been taken by Ucali, and was so much beloved by him that he became one of the most favoured youths. He came to be the most cruel renegade I ever saw. His name was Hassan Ajah, and he grew very rich and became the King of Algiers. With him I went there from Constantinople, rather glad to be so near to Spain. Not that I intended to write anyone about my unhappy lot, but to try if fortune would be kinder to me in Algiers than in Constantinople, where I had attempted in 1,000 ways to escape without ever finding a favourable time or chance. But in Algiers I resolved to seek for other means of effecting the purpose I cherished so dearly, for the hope of obtaining my liberty never deserted me, and when in my plots and schemes and attempts the result did not answer my expectations, without giving way to despair I immediately began to look out for or conjure up some new hope to support me, however faint or feeble it might be. In this way I lived on immured in a building or prison called by the Turks a Beno, in which they confine Christian captives, as well as those that are the king's as those belonging to private individuals, and also what they call those of the Almation, which is as much as to say the slaves of the municipality who serve the city in the public works and other employments. But captives of this kind recover their liberty with great difficulty, for as they are public property and have no particular master, there is no one with whom to treat for their ransom, even though they may have the means. To these benos, as I have said, some private individuals of the town are in the habit of bringing their captives, especially when they are to be ransomed, because there they can keep them in safety and comfort until their ransom arrives. The king's captives also that are on ransom do not go out to work with the rest of the crew, unless when their ransom is delayed, for then to make them write for it more pressingly, they compel them to go and work for wood, which is no light labour. I, however, was one of those on ransom, for when it was discovered that I was captain, although I declared my scanty means and want of fortune, nothing could dissuade them from including me among the gentlemen and those wanting to be ransomed. They put a chain on me more as a mark of this than to keep me safe, so I passed my life in that bano with several other gentlemen and persons of quality, marked out as held to be ransomed. But though at times, or rather almost always, we suffered from hunger and scanty clothing, nothing distressed us so much hearing and seeing at every turn the unexampled and unheard of cruelty my master inflicted upon the Christians. Every day he hanged a man, impaled one, cut off the ears of another, all with so little provocation, or so entirely without any, that the Turks acknowledged he did it merely for the sake of doing it, and because he was by nature murderously disposed toward the whole human race. The only one that fared at all well with him was a Spanish soldier, something de Saavedra by name, to whom he never gave a blow himself, or ordered a blow to be given, or addressed a hard word, although he had done things that will dwell in the memory of the people there for many a year, and all to recover his liberty. And for the least of the many things he did, we all dreaded he would be impaled, and he himself was in fear of it more than once. And only that time does not allow, I could tell you now something of what that soldier did, that would interest and astonish you more than the narration of my own tale. To go on with my story, the courtyard of our prisons was overlooked by the windows of the house belonging to a wealthy Moor of high position, and these, as is usual in Moorish houses, were rather loopholes in windows, and besides were covered with thick and close lattice work. It so happened then, as I was one day on the terrace of our prison, with 3 other comrades, trying to pass away the time, how far we could leap with our chains, we being alone, for all the other Christians had gone to work, I chanced to raise my eyes, and from one of these little closed windows I saw a reed appear with a cloth attached to one end of it, and it kept waving to and fro, and moving as if making signs to us to come and take it. We watched it, and one of those who were with me went and stood under the reed to see whether they would let it drop, or what they would do, but as he did so the reed was raised and moved from side to side as if they meant to say "No" by a shake of the head. The Christian came back, and it was again lowered, making the same movement as before. Another of my comrades went, and with him the same happened as with the first, and then the third went forward, but with the same result as the first and second. Seeing this, I did not like to try my luck, and as soon as I came under the reed, it was dropped and fell inside the bano at my feet. I hastened to untie the cloth, in which I perceived a knot, and in this were 10 cianis, which are the coins of base gold current among the Moors, and each worth 10 reals of our money. It is needless to say that I rejoiced at this godsend, and my joy was not less than my wonder as I strove to imagine how this good fortune could have come to us. But to me especially, for the evident unwillingness to drop the reed for any but me showed that it was for me the favour was intended. I took my welcome money, broke the reed, and returned to the terrace, and looking up at the window I saw a very white hand put out that opened and shut very quickly. From this we gathered or fancied that it must be some woman living in the house that had done us this kindness, and to show that we were grateful it we made salams after the fashion of the Moors, bowing the head and bending the body, and crossing the arms on the breast. Shortly afterwards, at the same window, a small cross made of reeds was put out and immediately withdrawn. The sign led us to believe that some Christian woman was a captive in the house, and that it was she who had been so good to us, but the whiteness of the hand and the bracelets we had perceived made us dismiss that idea, though we thought it might be one of the Christian renegades whom their masters very often take as lawful wives, and gladly, for they prefer them to the women of their own nation. And all our conjectures were wide of the truth. So from that time forward our sole occupation was watching and gazing at the window where the cross had appeared to us, as if it were our pole star. But at least 15 days passed without our seeing either it or the hand, or any sign, and though meanwhile we endeavoured with the whole utmost pains to ascertain who it was that lived in the house, and whether there were any Christian renegade in it, nobody could tell ever us anything more than that he who lived there was a rich Moor of high position, Haji Murato by name, formerly Alcaide of La Plata, an office of dignity high among them. But when we least thought it was going to rain any more cianis from that corner, we saw the reed suddenly appear with another cloth tied in a larger knot attached to it, and this at a time when on a former occasion the bano was deserted and unoccupied. We made a trial as before, each of the same 3 going forward before I did, but the reed was delivered to none but me, and on my approach it was let to drop. I untied the knot, and I found 40 Spanish gold crowns with a paper written in Arabic, and at the end of the writing there was a large cross drawn. I kissed the cross, took the crowns, and returned to the terrace, and we all made our salams. Again the hand appeared. I made signs that I would read the paper, and then the window was closed. We were all puzzled, though filled with joy at what had taken place, and as none of us understood Arabic, great our curiosity was to know what the paper continued, and still greater the difficulty of finding someone to read it. At last I resolved to confide in a renegade, a native of Murcia, who professed a very great friendship for me, and had given pledges that bound him to keep any secret I might entrust to him. For it is the custom with some renegades, when they intend to return to Christian territory, to carry about them certificates from captives of mark testifying in whatever form they can that such and such a renegade is a worthy man who has always shown kindness to Christians, and is anxious to escape on the first opportunity that may present itself. Some obtain these testimonials with good intentions, others put them to a cunning use, so when they go to pillage on Christian territory, if they chance to be cast away, or taken prisoners, they produce their certificates and say that from these papers may be seen the object they came for, which was to remain on Christian ground, that it was to this end they joined the Turks in their foray. In this way they escape the consequences of the first outburst and make their peace with the church before it does them any harm. And when they have the chance, they return to Barbary to become what they were before. Others, however, who procure these papers and make use of them honestly, and remain on Christian soil. This friend of mine, then, was one of these renegades that I have described. He had certificates from all our comrades, in which we testified in his favour as strongly as we could, and if the Moors had found the papers, they would have had him burned alive. I knew that he understood Arabic very well, and could not only speak, but also write it, but before I disclosed the whole matter to him, I asked him to read for me this paper which I had found by accident in a hole in my cell. He opened it and remained some time examining it and muttering to himself as he translated it. I asked him if he understood it, and he told me he did perfectly well, and that if I wished him to tell him its meaning word for word, I must give him a pen and ink, that he might do it more satisfactorily. We at once gave him what he required, and he set about translating it, bit by bit, and when he had done, he said, "All that is here in Spanish is what the Moorish paper contains, and you must bear in mind that when it says Layla Marian, it means Our Lady the Virgin Mary." We read the paper, and it ran thus: "When I was a child, my father had a slave who taught me to pray the Christian prayer in my own language, and told me many things about Layla Marian. The Christian died, and I know that she did not go to the fire, but to Allah, because since then I have seen her twice, and she told me to go to the land of the Christians to see Layla Marian, who had great love for me. I know not how to go. I have seen many Christians, but except thyself none has seemed to be to me a gentleman. I am young and beautiful, and have plenty of money to take with me. See if thou canst contrive how we go, and if thou wilt, thou shalt be my husband there, and if thou wilt not, it will not distress me, for Layla Marian will find me someone to marry me. I myself have written this. Have a care to whom thou givest it to read. Trust no more, for they are all perfidious. I am greatly troubled on this account, for I would not have thee confide in anyone, because if my father knew it, he would at once fling me down a wall, and cover me with stones. I will put a thread to the reed, tie the answer to it, and if thou hast no one to write for thee in Arabic, tell it to me by signs, for Layla Marian will make me understand thee. She and Allah, and this cross, which I often kiss as the captive bade me, protect thee." Judge, sirs, whether we had reason for surprise and joy at the words of this paper, and both one and the other were so great that the renegade perceived that the paper had not been found by chance, but had been in reality addressed to some one of us, and he begged us, if that what he suspected were the truth, to trust him and tell him all, for he would risk his life for our freedom, and so saying, he took out from his breast a metal crucifix, and with many tears swore by God, the image represented, in whom, sinful and wicked as he was, he truthfully and faithfully believed, to be loyal to us and keep secret whatever we chose to reveal to him, for he thought and almost foresaw that by means of her who had written that paper, he and all of us would obtain our liberty, and he himself obtained the object he so much desired, his restoration to the bosom of the Holy Mother Church, from which by his own sin and ignorance he was now severed like a corrupt limb. And the renegade said this with so many tears and such signs of repentance that with one consent we all agreed to tell him the whole truth of the matter, and so we gave him a full account of all, without hiding anything from him. We pointed out to him the window at which the reed appeared, and he by that means took note of the house, and resolved to ascertain with particular care who lived in it. We agreed also that it would be advisable to answer the Moorish lady's letter, and the renegade, without a moment's delay, took down the words I dictated to him, which were exactly what I tell you, for nothing of importance that took place in this affair has escaped my memory, or ever will, while life lasts. This, then, was the answer returned to the Moorish lady: "The true Allah protect thee, lady, and that blessed Marian, who is the true mother of God, and who has put into thy heart to go into the land of the Christians, because she loves thee." Entreat her that she be pleased to show thee how thou canst execute the commands she gives thee, for she will, such is her goodness. On my own part, and on that of all these Christians who are with me, I promise to do all that we can for thee, even to death. Fail not to write me and inform me of what thou dost mean to do, and I will always answer thee. For the great Allah has given us a Christian captive who can speak and write thy language well, as thou mayest see by this paper. Without fear, therefore, thou canst inform us of all thou wouldst. As to what thou sayest, that if thou dost reach the land of the Christians, thou wilt be my wife, I give thee my promise upon it as a good Christian, and know that the Christians keep their promises better than the Moors. Allah and Mary and his mother watch over thee, my lady. The paper being written and folded, I waited 2 days until the bano was empty as before, and immediately repaired to the usual walk of the terrace to see if there were any sign of the reed, which was not long in making its appearance. As soon as I saw it, although I could not distinguish who put it out, I showed the paper as a sign to attach the thread, but it was already fixed to the reed, and to it I tied the paper. And shortly afterwards our star once more made its appearance with the white flag of peace, the little bundle. It was dropped, and I picked it up, and found in cloth and gold and silver coins of all sorts more than 50 crowns, which 50 times more strengthened our joy and doubled our hope of gaining our liberty. That very night our renegade returned and said he had learned that the Moor, who had been told that we lived in that house, that his name was Haji Murato, that he was enormously rich, and that he had only one daughter, the heiress of all his wealth, and that it was the general opinion throughout the city that she was the most beautiful woman in Barbary, and that several of the viceroys who came there had sought her for a wife, but that she had always been unwilling to marry, and he had learned, moreover, that she had had a Christian slave who was now dead, all which agreed with the contents of the paper. We immediately took counsel with the renegade as to what means would have to be adopted in order to carry off the Moorish lady and bring us all to Christian territory. And in the end it was agreed that for the present we should wait for a second communication from Zoraida, for that was the name of her who now desires to be called Maria, because we saw clearly that she and no one else could find a way out of all these difficulties. When we had decided upon this, the renegade told us not to be uneasy, for he would lose his life or restore us to liberty. For 4 days the bano was filled with people, for which reason the reed delayed its appearance for 4 days. But at the end of that time, when the bano was, as it generally was, empty, it appeared with a cloth so bulky that it promised a happy birth. Reed and cloth came down to me, and I found another paper and 100 crowns in gold, without any other coin. The renegade was present, and in our cell we gave him the paper, and read, which was to this effect: I cannot think of a plan, señor, for our going to Spain, nor has Lela Marien shown me one, though I have asked her. All that can be done is for me to give you plenty of money in gold from this window. With it ransom yourself and your friends, and let one of you go to the land of the Christians, and there buy a vessel and come back for the others. And he will find me in my father's garden, which is at the Babazon gate near the seashore, where I shall be all this summer with my father and my servants. You can carry me away from there by night without any danger, and bring me to the vessel. And remember thou art to be my husband, else I will pray to Marian and punish thee. If thou canst not trust any one to go for the vessel, ransom thyself, and do thou go, for I know thou wilt return more surely than any other, as thou art a gentleman and a Christian. Endeavour to make thyself acquainted with the garden, and when I see thee walking yonder, I shall know that the bano is empty, and I will give thee abundance of money. Allah protect thee, señor. These were the words and contents of the second paper, and on hearing them, each declared himself willing to be the ransom one, and promised to go in return with a scrupulous good faith. And I too made the same offer, but all this the renegade objected, saying that he would not on any account consent to one of us being set free before all went together, as experience had taught him how ill those who have been set free keep their promises, which they made in captivity, for captives of distinction frequently had recourse to this plan, paying the ransom of one who was to go back to Valencia or Majorca with money to enable him to arm a bank in return for the others who had ransomed him, but who never came back, for recovered liberty and the dread of losing it again effaced from the memory all the obligations in the world. And to prove the truth of what he said, he told us briefly of what had happened to a certain Christian gentleman, almost at that very time, the strangest case that had ever occurred even there, where astonishing and marvellous things are happening every instant. In short, he ended by saying that what he could and ought to be done was to give the money intended for the ransom of one of us Christians to him, so that he might with it buy a vessel there in Algiers under the pretence of becoming a merchant and trader to Tunis and along the coast, and when the master of the vessel it would be easy for him to hit on some way of getting us all out of the bano and putting us on board, especially if the Moorish lady gave, as she said, money enough to ransom all, because once free it would be the easiest thing in the world for us to embark, even in open day. But the greatest difficulty was that the Moors do not allow any renegade to buy or own any craft unless it be a large vessel for going on roving expeditions, because they are afraid that anyone who buys a small vessel, especially if he a Spaniard, wants it only for the purpose of escaping to Christian territory. This he could get over by arranging with a Taggart and Moor to go shares with him in the purchase of the vessel, and in the profit on the cargo, and under cover of this he could become the master of the vessel, in which he looked upon all the rest as accomplished. But though to me and my comrades it had seemed a better plan to send one to Majorca for the vessel, as the Moorish lady suggested, we did not dare to oppose him, fearing that if we did not go, as he said, he would denounce us and place us in danger of losing all our lives if he were to disclose our dealings with Zoraida, for whose life he would have given all our own. We therefore resolved to put ourselves in the hands of God and in the renegades, and at the same time an answer was given to Zoraida, telling her we would do all she recommended, for she had given us good advice as if Lela Marian had delivered it, and that it depended on her alone whether we were to defer the business or to put it into execution at once. I renewed my promise to be her husband, and thus the next day that the bano chanced to be empty, she at different times gave us by means the reed and cloth 2,000 gold crowns and a paper in which she said that the next Juna, that is to say Friday, she was going to her father's garden, but that before she went she would give us more money, and if it were not enough we were to let her know, and she would come and give us as much as we asked for her father had so much he would not miss it, and besides he kept all the keys. We at once gave the renegade 500 crowns to buy the vessel, and with 800 I ransomed myself, giving the money to a Valencian merchant who happened to be in Algiers at the time, and who had released me on his word, pledging it that on the arrival of the first ship from Valencia he would pay my ransom. For if he had given the money at once, it would have made the king suspect that my ransom money had been for a long time in Algiers, and that the merchant had for his own advantage kept it secret. In fact, my master was so difficult to deal with that I dared not on any account pay down the money at once. The Thursday before the Friday on which the fair Zoraida was to go to the garden, she gave us 1,000 crowns more, and warned us of her departure, begging me, if I were ransomed, to find her at her father's garden at once, and by all means seek an opportunity of going there to see her. I answered in a few words that I would do so, and that you must remember to commend us to Lela Marian with all the prayers the captive had taught her. This having been done, steps were taken to ransom our 3 comrades, so as to enable them to quit the bano, unless seeing me ransom and themselves not, though the money was forthcoming, they should make a disturbance about it, and the devil should prompt them to do something that might injure Zoraida. For their proposition might be sufficient to relieve me from this apprehension, nevertheless I was unwilling to run any risk in the matter, and so I had them ransomed in the same way as I was, handing over all the money to the merchant, so that he might with safety and confidence give security, without, however, confiding our arrangement in secret to him, which might have been dangerous. End of chapter 40.